It may be the international break, but Newcastle United are never too far away from the news. In this video, we're going to be discussing Dan Burns' hand injury, Sandro Tonali's comments on his future, and also Sven Botman's situation as he wants a new contract amid interest from Liverpool. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for all your support. As always, you can hit subscribe and like on this video. It would be massive help. And also there's a link to Patreon in the description below. 7-day free trial for members where you get extra content and more access to talking to me before $4.99 a month for that privilege. There's also, you can support me for $2.99 a month and you get ad-free versions of these videos. Today we have Sandro Tonali's future on the agenda, as well as Dan Burns' fitness, with the news that he broke his hand in the victory over Nottingham Forest last week, and also Sven Botman's situation as he regains fitness and form in a black and white shirt. We'll start though with Sandro Tonali and some really interesting comments on his future. The quote is as follows: "My future, you never know what will happen. I tell everybody that it is possible to return to play in Italy, in brackets. I do not close the door on Italy. It's my country. Maybe not now because I have found stability at Newcastle, but Serie A is getting better. The quality of the teams is getting stronger." Those are the crux of what has been, I think, quite a concerning development for some Newcastle fans. But I'm here to allay the fears and basically talk a little bit about what I spoke about the other week when we talked about Tonali's contract and Botman's contract, funnily enough, as well. The situation with both of them is very similar at this stage to what it was with Alexander Isak maybe last year, and Newcastle do really need to learn from that situation. Yes, Alexander Isak did not cover himself in glory. Yes, Alexander Isak did not behave particularly well in the end, and it has ended with a really bitter taste. Newcastle also made some really big mistakes along the way in that situation, and they have to learn from that with these players if they don't want something similar to develop over the next couple of years. Tonali and Italy, I think you've got to give a little bit of context here that Italian football and Italian footballers are very sort of similar to English footballers in some ways. The football has been such a big part of their life growing up, and it is such a big part of the country's culture that most Italian players want to play in Italy. That's the way that they grow up. They only want to play in Serie A. They only want to play for their country, really. And it takes a lot for an Italian player to want to move away from Serie A. And Sandro Tonali doing that, moving away from Milan as well. Family bleed red and black. So it was a massive achievement in a sense for Newcastle to actually lure him away from Milan because he loves that club so much. His family, I think his dad's an ultra at Milan. So that sort of gives you a little bit of context around how impressive it was that Newcastle were able to lure him at the time, not just in terms of the quality of player here that we now see every week. I mean, he's so consistent. I did a video the other week talking about whether he's the best midfielder that Newcastle have ever had, because he's certainly one of the best, if not the best, that I've ever seen. And I grant, off the back of that video in the comment section, lots of people, because I know a lot of you viewers are a little bit older, there was a little bit of stick for me in that after that, because I haven't seen so many players from the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. Absolutely grant that. But that doesn't really take away from what Sandro Tonali has brought to Newcastle over the last couple of years, particularly since his ban and the whole thing. And that has been a big context into how happy he is at Newcastle. There was a comment in the summer made about how he has felt safe, and he said that sort of there in that comment there. Again, he reiterated it, that Newcastle is a place where he feels safe and feels loved and feels comfortable, and that is not something to be sniffed at. I think he feels like he's got to repay Newcastle for a certain amount of the love and the affection that they gave him at his lowest point when he was banned. All of that is still true, but again, you've got to give the context that Serie A is where his heart is. Newcastle are the new context here. Newcastle have changed his perception and changed his perspective maybe, whereas his love and his heart will always be in Italy. Just as Newcastle fans are loving the idea that Elliot Anderson might want to join Newcastle one day in the future, it's very similar for Sandro Tonali. You know, he absolutely loves Milan, he absolutely loves Serie A, and Juventus have been heavily linked with him in the past as well. I think you've got to give that context, again, the context of where he is as well when he's saying these things, similar to back in the day when Johan Cabaye would go away and Moussa Sissoko would go away. These comments are nowhere near as pointed as often those ones were when they went back to France and made comments about their future, because the club is a very different club now. Sandro Tonali can, up to a point, achieve what he wants to achieve at Newcastle, but we also have to accept, I think, that Newcastle are at a certain point in the food chain. That's what they found with Alexander Isak. The whole situation around what Isak did and how it worked out was the problem, not necessarily that he wanted to join Liverpool, because I think we can all accept that he is more likely to win trophies and win titles immediately at Liverpool. Sandro Tonali, there might be a point where he looks at that and thinks, I can go and win a title in the Premier League with somebody else, or back in Serie A if Juventus are strong enough, if Milan come back. I don't think there is anything to really worry about in the immediate term. He has 3 years on his Newcastle contract. They are back where they should have been with Alexander Isak, but the trouble was that they'd made such a pig's ear of the whole situation on a human level with Isak, telling him he could have had a contract, not telling him he could have had a contract. Obviously, we know that it was two different people saying that, but again, the club's message changed and the club didn't really treat him in the way that he probably deserved to be treated at that point. As I say, from then, he was completely out of order what he did last summer, but something to be learned from when it comes to Sandro Tonali, because he is that good as well. He can go and play for anybody in the world, in my opinion, and Newcastle have to do their absolute utmost to be able to keep him for as long as possible. And he seems very happy at Newcastle. He said that in those comments there, but one day he could return to Serie A. That could be when he's 33. Who knows? I mean, Serie A is known for being a place where older players thrive. So it could be not for another 10 years that he goes back to Serie A. I don't think, crucially, that people like Juventus or Milan or Napoli or whoever could afford him at this stage, with his contract being what it is. But I also think that Newcastle have to be aware that Premier League clubs will be interested if his contract goes down to 2 years. The Newcastle do have this crucial point now this season where they have to tie into a new contract. The crunch point is coming, and these comments are a very pointed reminder of what they got wrong with Alexander Isak in terms of how they handled it. And they need to get that right. And the same goes for Sven Botman as well. I think he's got 2 years in his contract now, so he's going down. He wants a new contract. Apparently, he will get a new contract, I'm very sure, from his recent performances and the fact that he's grown back into the team alongside Malik Chow. We've been talking so openly and so gushingly about the pair of them two together. I've written about that as well. But it really does feel, I think, like Newcastle are in a strong position with Botman, but Liverpool having him on a shortlist, obviously he's got a good close friendship with Alex Isak as well. That could come into play. I'm sure he will look at it and think, can I go and win things elsewhere? This is something that Newcastle have to deal with. They are very, very vulnerable to losing a number of players if they don't continue to improve. A lot of these players are good enough to go and win things and are of interest to other clubs. It wasn't just Isak. We've seen Gordon, we've seen Bruno, we've seen Tonali, as I've just mentioned, now Botman. Other players as well. Livramento's been linked with Manchester City. Newcastle need to continue moving forward, but also keeping the players happy with new contracts as well. We spoke about this a few weeks ago, but Liverpool having him on a shortlist, I don't think it'll come to fruition. I think they'll really push for Mark Gahey again in January, and maybe then next summer they might look at things and have him on a shortlist. It's a long way till Newcastle are facing anything of difficulty when it comes to Botman and Liverpool, but it's a warning. I think Newcastle have to heed these warnings, as I said the other week, and Tonali and Botman are both good enough to go and achieve other things elsewhere if Newcastle don't treat them the way that they deserve to be treated. And as I say, Alexander Isak did not do himself any favours this summer. He absolutely tarnished his legacy. He didn't need to do what he did, but it started from Newcastle not really doing what they needed to do in the early days in terms of making him feel wanted, in terms of making him feel like he needed to be at Newcastle to achieve his things. There are limitations to what Newcastle can do, there are limitations to what happens, but Newcastle need to make sure that both Tonali and Botman are as happy as possible. Do I see Tonali playing back in Serie A before he retires? Absolutely. Italian football is so important to Italian players. Growing up with an affinity to a club like Milan who've got such a history, that sort of thing doesn't just go away. In the same way, as I said, Elliot Anderson, I think he would love to play for Newcastle again. It doesn't mean that he's definitely going to leave Nottingham Forest. It's not disrespectful to Nottingham Forest. It doesn't mean that that's going to happen. But very much the same situation with the shoe on the other foot. So I think Sandro Tonali is considering Italy, or will consider Italy one day, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at his peak years, because I think he can achieve much more at Newcastle. Newcastle is in a strong position, and it's not something at the moment to worry about. Finally, just before we wrap up, Dan Burn apparently has broken his hand. Apparently he broke his hand against Nottingham Forest in the victory, but he isn't out. He sat on the bench for England yesterday in a 3-0 victory over Wales. He's ready to play against Latvia next week as well. Come back and play for Newcastle too. He's not going to be joining a growing number of players on the injury table for Newcastle, which is good news, but shows the sort of commitment level and shows the desire from Burn. I think it shows his personality in droves, because if you remember 2 years ago when he damaged his back, I got news when I was out in Dortmund that he was going to be out for a while, but he could come back half of the time, and he did. He came back 3 or 4 weeks out of a 6-week injury and carried on, because his pain threshold must be incredible. His desire and his drive to perform for Newcastle and England as well is absolutely wonderful. But news that Dan Burn has broken his hand, we'll see how that develops, because again, that's another injury for a potential left back. No Livramento for a few weeks. Looks like no Lewis Hall for a few weeks as well. So Newcastle need to keep Dan Burn as fit as possible, and this isn't good news, but also it isn't bad news. It doesn't mean that he's going to be out for a few weeks, but just one to watch as well. Thanks so much for joining me on today's video. Like, share and subscribe. I did, as I say, watch the England game yesterday. I thought Anthony Gordon was really good too, but I'll be back next week with more content ahead of the return of the Premier League on Patreon as well. The link is in the description. Like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you then. Cheers.